Kamala Harris, she's just your classic run-of-the-mill, straight-shooting, middle-of-the-road, moderate Democrat, right? Well, that's what some people in the media are saying. That's what some people are telling you. But what does her past illustrate? What does her policy positions that she's advanced suggest? Do they suggest that she's this moderate, common sense Democrat? What about just a left-wing liberal, or maybe just even a progressive? I don't think so. I actually think the record shows pretty clearly that Kamala Harris is a socialist, a full-blown, radical, crazy socialist. I think that's what the record shows, and I'm going to prove that to you today. We're going to talk about 10 pieces of legislation that Kamala Harris has either co-sponsored or sponsored while she was in the Senate. We're not even going to take a look at all of the crazy stuff that she supported going back many years before she was even in the Senate. We're just looking at her very short time in the U.S. Senate and all the crazy policies that she supported on this episode of the Justin Haskins Show. And by the time this episode is over, you're going to know in your bones, if you didn't know already, that Kamala Harris is as crazy and radical as it gets. But before we get to that, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel. Please, please, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment. All of these things are going to help this content reach far more people. Big tech algorithms use likes and subscriptions and comments as a way to illustrate or as a way to recognize that content is well liked by the viewers and should be shown to more. So you can help this channel. It's still a fairly new channel. You can help us out by liking, subscribing, and leaving comments. It doesn't cost you anything at all, just a few moments of your time, and it means a great deal to me, and I would really appreciate it. So thank you very much. I read all the comments, by the way, and even the ones that are absolutely brutal towards me, I still read them, and I appreciate every single one. Okay, let's get into the topic. I have an article that's going to be coming out probably with The Blaze. When you watch this video, it may not be out yet. I think it's going to come out on August 11th or so, August 11th or 12th. But I may release this video before then, so we didn't have access to it when I was recording it. So instead, I'm going to pull up the PDF version of the op-ed that I wrote for The Blaze, and we're going to go through step by step or bill by bill the different pieces of legislation that I want you to take a look at that prove definitively that Kamala Harris is a crazy, radical, socialistic candidate, probably the most radical candidate for president that's reached the top of a ticket that we've had maybe ever in American history. Certainly not since Franklin Roosevelt or something. I think she's more radical than Barack Obama. I mean, maybe Barack Obama was just as radical as she is, but just wasn't willing to govern that way. I think he cared more about being liked than he did about his socialistic tendencies. Certainly more radical than Bill Clinton or George Bush or Donald Trump or any of those people. Bernie Sanders would be the only one who I can think of who would be crazier than Kamala Harris, to the left of Kamala Harris. But Bernie Sanders didn't actually win the nomination for the Democratic Party. He got screwed out of that nomination. So he didn't actually get the nomination. So he doesn't count. So this is the closest that a really radical socialistic person has ever gotten to being president of the United States. Again, that assumes some things about Barack Obama that may not be right, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say Barack Obama governed exactly the way he wanted to. His policies reflect exactly who he is. If we make that assumption, then Kamala Harris is far to the left of Barack Obama. So you may think that's kind of crazy, but once we finish going through all of the things that I want to show you, I think you're going to agree with me. I really do. All right, so let's pull up the document here, and we'll start going through it. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal. Many people forget that, yes, Joe Biden did put forward a Green New Deal, a bill that was meant to help spur the transition away from fossil fuels here in the United States. And it had a whole bunch of non-energy related things jammed in it. It was probably going to end up being trillions of dollars worth of expenses when it's all said and done to the economy. Total disaster. But before that Green New Deal, there was a more famous, more important Green New Deal advanced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a self-described socialist from the state of New York. AOC put forward a Green New Deal proposal right when she entered Congress back in 2019. She first started working on it in 2018 with a bunch of really crazy socialistic activist groups like the Sunrise Movement, for example, and others. And then she rolled out the legislative proposal in the form of a resolution in Congress in 2019. At that time, she was the darling of the media. I mean, AOC was absolutely everywhere. She was absolutely everywhere. She was on the covers of magazines. She was on every single television show. Radio couldn't stop talking about her. She was everywhere. And the Green New Deal was the big thing that she was promoting. What made the Green New Deal so crazy was that the Green New Deal wasn't just a transition away from fossil fuels. It wasn't just a big green energy infrastructure bill. That was part of what it was, but it also included a whole bunch of other very socialistic programs within the Green New Deal. Things like universal government-run healthcare, the elimination of private health insurance, a government jobs guarantee, upgrading every single home and business building, or the vast majority of them, in the United States, a universal access to all kinds of things, healthy foods, for example, basic income programs, vague promises about free college tuition, all kinds of crazy stuff was included, a new system of public banks, a new grid, and as I think I mentioned earlier, the elimination of fossil fuels in the United States of America almost entirely within a 10-year period. So this was a crazy piece of legislation. Well, when it was proposed as a resolution, there were only, I think it was about 14 senators. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was about 14 senators in the U.S. Senate that co-sponsored it, because AOC's in the House, so she needed sponsors in the Senate. One of the co-sponsors of the Green New Deal was Bernie Sanders. Another was Elizabeth Warren, both of them socialists. Other far left-wing politicians in the Senate also supported it. And of course, one of those people was Kamala Harris. She co-sponsored the Green New Deal. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because this just on its own, if this was the only piece of evidence that I was going to show you, I think this is an open and shut case. Kamala Harris must be a socialist because the Green New Deal is the most socialistic legislative proposal that we've had in the United States probably ever. It's incredibly socialistic, at least to get that kind of press and attention. So all told, Green New Deal would cost as much as $92 trillion, according to an estimate by the American Action Forum. That's on the high end of their estimates, but I don't think it's an unreasonable estimate. I think it's very possible. So this is the first piece of evidence, and it's the best piece of evidence. Kamala Harris is a socialist. She's a radical. How do we know she's a radical? Because the Green New Deal is insanely radical. And of course, it died in Congress very quickly, very publicly, horrible death, because the backlash against the Green New Deal was absolutely nuts and well-deserved. So that's my first piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence is Climate Equity Act of 2020. This did not get anywhere near as much attention as the Green New Deal. This was sponsored by Kamala Harris. So she wasn't just a co-sponsor. She was an actual sponsor of the legislation. She's the one who introduced it. So the Climate Equity Act would create a climate and environmental equity office. Equity is a socialistic term, by the way. Notice it's not equality, it's equity. Equity means equal outcomes. You can only have perfectly equal outcomes with some sort of socialistic discriminatory system in place. There is no other way to get perfectly equal outcomes. So she wants a climate and environmental equity office that would be housed within the Congressional Budget Office. And this new agency would basically be in charge of ensuring that far left-wing ideas about radical climate change policies are included in new legislation, regulations, government investments, and other things that are related to environmental and climate issues. It would also require government agencies to publish every other year a climate and I think every other year, a climate and environmental justice accountability agenda. That's a direct quote. And ensure that proposed regulations include an environmental justice analysis when that rule might have a significant impact on a substantial number of residents within frontline communities. So essentially taking radical climate policies and inserting them, jamming them in to all kinds of other pieces of legislation that come through the door for Congress. That's what this Climate Equity Act of 2020 would do. So really radical policy. Didn't get anywhere near enough attention. I think it died pretty easily, which is probably why it didn't get a lot of attention. But worth considering now that Kamala Harris might be president of the United States. Number 3, Medicare for All Act of 2019. Medicare for All is a government-run healthcare system. In 2019, Bernie Sanders was still the face of Medicare for All. He introduced legislation. He had introduced legislation before, but in 2019, he made a big push for Medicare for All. It would have established a government-run healthcare system, eliminated effectively private health insurance across the United States. Everybody would be forced to be beholden to the government for their healthcare needs. Kamala Harris co-sponsored that legislation from Bernie Sanders. So again, Bernie Sanders, face of socialism in America, along with AOC, face of socialism in America. Kamala Harris, this was a signature bill, and Kamala Harris backed it 100%. Now, when she ran for president, shortly after this legislation had been introduced, because remember, Bernie Sanders was running for president too, she came out with her own version of government-run healthcare that was a part of her presidential platform. And it was very similar to Bernie Sanders' plan. It was slightly more moderate. She did allow for some private health insurance in her plan, whereas Sanders basically eliminated it altogether. But it was still very far to the left. It was still essentially a single payer or a mostly single payer system. Really crazy. The Mercatus Center, by the way, which is a nonpartisan think tank housed at George Mason University, estimated that the cost to the federal government to pay for Bernie Sanders' healthcare proposal would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $32 trillion over a single decade. Now, obviously, the total cost wouldn't actually be $32 trillion because the $32 trillion is offset by some existing healthcare spending, but ultimately still a massive bill for taxpayers to pay. No doubt about that whatsoever. A huge boon for big corporations who pay a ton of money for health insurance and now all of a sudden wouldn't have to do that anymore. So really radical proposal backed by Kamala Harris. It's just more proof of her socialistic tendencies. Number 4, COVID Bias and Anti-Racism Training Act of 2020. So this bill was rolled out during the height of COVID-19. She sponsored this legislation, so she introduced this herself. It would fund these really radical, quote, anti-racism training programs that would be rolled out for healthcare providers. The really insane thing about this was not just that it would provide money to develop these programs, but it would mandate that the Department of Health and Human Services, this is according to one of the official summaries of the bill, quote, develop requirements for bias and anti-racism training that aligns with continuing education requirements of applicable state licensing bodies, such as medical boards. In other words, if you want to be a doctor, you have to go through this crazy anti-racism, left-wing, Ibram X. Kendi sort of white people are evil training course. And that's essentially what this bill was designed to do. So that was the COVID-19 Bias and Anti-Racism Training Act of 2020. Really crazy stuff. Number 5, Saving Our Street Act. This also was another COVID bill. 2020, She sponsored legislation. It was sold as this aid program for small businesses who are suffering badly in COVID-19. I wonder why. Maybe because the government shut down the entire economy and destroyed people's lives unnecessarily. I don't know. Maybe that's why. But what differentiated her program from a lot of other programs was that it very specifically gives priority to, quote, people of color, veterans, women-owned community businesses, and socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, which obviously is a completely discriminatory provision. So if you happen to be a white guy or an Asian guy who owns a small business or something, then this legislation isn't for you. But the business right next door to you that's owned by a Hispanic woman, this legislation would help that person out. So just a completely racist, horribly discriminatory action, legislative proposal. I don't believe it was passed into law. Number 6, VoteSafe Act of 2020. This, if you like election integrity, then you know that one of the worst things that you can do for election integrity is to allow no excuse mail-in balloting, where anyone who wants, for no reason at all, can just have a mail-in ballot and send it in. Because how do you know who those people really are? Drop-off boxes for ballots, online ballot requests, all of these things are not good for election integrity. And that's what the VoteSafe Act would have done. It would have imposed this on all jurisdictions. At least that's how I read the legislation. All states, all jurisdictions, all across the country would be forced to do these things. Now, there were a lot of states that did this on their own, but there were also a lot of states that did not do that. And those states would have been forced to do it for the 2020 election under the VoteSafe Act. So just really radical, far left-wing policy. A lot of liberal Democrats actually don't support all of those policies. So really, really far to the left. Number 7 is the Maternal Care Act. The Maternal Care Act is legislation that Harris sponsored in 2019. So this is a pre-COVID bill. It would provide government funding for health professional training programs that it's designed to deal with, quote unquote, implicit bias. And in the summary, it says e.g., racial bias. So we're talking about implicit racial bias in the practice of obstetrics and gynecology. So in particular, it was designed to deal with that. Of course, I mentioned earlier the legislation, the COVID-19 Bias and Anti-Racism Training Act of 2020, which would have had similar policies for all medical specialties. But this one was dealing solely with obstetrics and gynecology. Now, this claim of implicit bias, which is really this idea that really only exists within the far left, that white people in particular, but many other kinds of racial groups, I guess, have these secret racism within them that they don't even really know about. And it's implicit and it sort of informs everything that they do. It affects everything that they do, even though they don't necessarily know it or they're not trying to be racist. They still are secretly acting in a racist way because they just can't help it, or that the system is designed to help white people, even though it doesn't explicitly put a policy in place that says we're only helping white people. It's just underneath the surface designed to help white people in some special way or some other racial group. Again, it doesn't have to be just about white people. It could be other people as well. Asians in particular tend to be targeted by this sort of thing. So this idea of implicit bias, implicit racism, all of this, of course, there is some degree of truth in it for some people, but to just take these broad strokes and say, oh, there's all this implicit racism and implicit bias and all of this stuff in medicine, which is something Kamala Harris clearly believes in. This is, again, the second piece of legislation we've talked about already that deal with that. Is just a really radical far left-wing idea that most common sense, middle of the road Democrats don't believe. Almost all Republicans reject, almost all libertarians reject. It's really only the radicals on the left that believe in this sort of thing. Again, there is some degree of it, of course, just like with anything. But is it this widespread problem that we need to have these anti-racism training courses? No, I don't think so. No. Number 8 on our list is the Dunn Act. The Dunn Act is an immigration related piece of legislation proposed in July of 2019. Dunn Act would ban the Department of Homeland Security from building or expanding immigration detention facilities. So without new or expanded immigration detention facilities, where would you put people who come to the country illegally? Where would you put them if you can't detain them in a facility because all the facilities are full? Like when you have and they're not always full, but when you have a flood of illegal immigration, as we've had since Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have taken over in the White House, what happens to people who come here illegally if you can't expand or build new detention centers? It's a crazy policy to try to put that into law. And that's what Kamala Harris's Dunn Act would do. Well, what would you do with people? Well, you would just release them into society. And I don't think Kamala Harris has any problem with just letting people come here illegally and just releasing them and not holding them in any kind of detention facility, even though they came here illegally and broke the rules and didn't do the things they were supposed to do. That, to me, is just absolutely nuts. I think almost everyone watching this video would agree with that. That's the Dunn Act. Number 9, Environmental Justice for All Act. The Environmental Justice for All Act, I believe this was a 2019 legislation, although it could have been 2020, but I think it was 2019. This was introduced by Harris, so this was her dreamed up in her beautiful mind. It would establish, quote, several environmental justice requirements, advisory boards, and programs to address the disproportionate adverse human health or environmental effects of federal laws or programs on communities of color, low-income communities, or tribal and indigenous communities. More specifically, it would prohibit, quote, disparate impacts, not treatment, effects on the basis of race, color, or national origin as discrimination. So why is this important? Well, in addition to just inserting all kinds of radical environmental ideas throughout government, which is what this is trying to do, the idea that it would prohibit, quote, disparate impacts on the basis of race, color, or national origin as discrimination means that anytime you're doing something that would fall under this law that has a different impact on different demographics, that would mean it's discriminatory and it has to be changed. Well, that may not seem like a big deal, but that's a huge thing, because almost any law that you pass is going to have disparate impacts on different groups of people. I mean, it's almost impossible to pass a law that results in exactly perfect impacts on all people. Many laws have disparate impacts. Take any big government program. The vast majority of government programs result in different impacts on different groups. So to say that means there's racism and that this is discrimination and that we need to deal with the equitable outcomes problem is a socialistic Marxist idea. Further proof, once again, Kamala Harris is not interested in equality and how people are being treated. It's not about being treated equally under the law or being treated equally in society. It's not about equal treatment. It's not about equality. It's about equity. It's about making sure the outcome is equal. And that is a socialistic idea. The outcome can't be equal without discrimination. That's the only way to make outcomes equal, because people naturally, any group of people, or at any point in human history, you're never going to have exactly equal outcomes. Like, when you apply a policy to millions and millions or hundreds of millions of people. Like, you're never going to end up with that. And so the only way you can do it is with a bunch of social engineering at the end of all of that. And that can only be done by discriminating against certain groups over other groups. First of all, you got to group people together into different categories, which I think is inherently discriminatory. And then you have to treat them differently, which is also discriminatory. So just a really radical policy, but very much in line with the other things we've seen so far. That brings us to number 10. The Patsy T. Mink and Louise M. Slaughter Gender Equity, there's that word again, in Education Act of 2018. Harris was one of only 13 senators to co-sponsor this Gender Equity in Education Act. The legislation was designed to create a new, quote, Office for Gender Equity, which would be within the Department of Education. Office for Gender Equity. Among other powers, the Office for Gender Equity would, quote, provide grants and perform activities to reduce or prevent discrimination, bias, harassment, or violence based on actual or perceived sex, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions or stereotypes in all areas of education. Okay, so obviously, some of this is a good thing. We don't want women or anyone to be treated just in a discriminatory way, in a violent way, based on their sex or sexual orientation or anything, right? We don't want that. Nobody wants discrimination in education. Okay, and there's a lot of other laws that already protect against that, both at the state and the federal level. So what is this trying to do? What this is trying to do is to use money to impose even more radical ideas about equal outcomes, equity, equal outcomes in education, which is inherently discriminatory. But notice it's not saying that it's going to be about equality. It's going to be about equity, right? There's all sorts of things in the bill dealing with implicit bias and how implicit bias needs to be dealt with, anti-racism training courses and things like that, presumably is how they would deal with that. But in particular, the reason I highlighted this is because as far as I can tell from my reading, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but as far as I can tell from my reading, if this law were to go into effect, the really most radical part of it would be that I don't see how you could have women's sports survive with this law in place, because it very clearly says that it would aim to reduce or prevent discrimination based on gender identity and in all areas of education. Now, if gender identity is a protected class in all areas of education, which includes girls' sports, my understanding is that it includes girls' sports based on other provisions of law and things like that. And maybe I have that wrong, but that's my understanding of it. Then I don't see how you could have prevent transgender girls from participating in girls' sports nationwide. Now, maybe there's some sort of carve out for that, or maybe there's some way around that I don't quite understand. But it seems like that's what one of the goals of this. And I've read some of the press materials from some of the Congress. I think it was a congresswoman who was also involved in this legislation. I think it may have been the sponsor even. The woman's name escapes me, but she was representing California. And it seemed like that was one of the main goals for this, is to protect trans girls in girls' sports. But the problem with that, of course, is trans girls in many cases have a completely unfair advantage over other girls. And it is just completely unfair and ultimately will destroy girls' sports and women's sports at a national and perhaps even international level if you have this kind of policy in place. So again, this law, some of it I found a little bit confusing. Maybe I'm misunderstanding exactly what, but it really seems like that was one of the main goals. Either to use money. I think it was mainly to use money as a way of tying strings to schools, tying strings to money provided by the federal government to schools across the country, so that they feel like they have to have policies that I think would undermine girl sports. So this is a really radical idea. The vast majority of Americans do not support it. But this is something that it seems like Kamala Harris was a big fan of all the way back in 2018, which was 6 years ago. So it wasn't even it was even less popular back then. So I really think that's a radical piece of legislation. And I also just don't trust the Office for Gender Equity and having a new federal agency tying money to various social justice equity causes from the federal government and kind of imposing these things on state and local governments. I just think education is none of the federal government's business. It belongs with the state and local governments. The federal government should stay out of it entirely. If some state or local government wants to have Gender Equity and Education Act, then they have every right to do that. If they want transgender girls in sports, they have every right to do that. But I just think you would destroy girls' sports with this kind of policy nationwide, and I just don't even think the federal government has the right to do it at any rate. So another really radical piece of legislation. So that's 10 right there. And there's so many more that we could talk about, but do I really need to say anything more? I mean, isn't it pretty clear when you add that to her record, Kamala Harris's record as vice president of the United States, one of the worst vice presidents we've ever had, one of the worst presidents we've ever had, Joe Biden, a horrible administration, massive economic problems, huge federal deficits. We've had, even post-COVID, okay, huge federal, because I don't blame anyone for what happened during COVID necessarily in terms of spending, but post-COVID, huge federal deficits for Joe Biden, massive catastrophes in Afghanistan, Ukraine being invaded by Russia, which I think has a lot to do with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's weaknesses. Kamala Harris is obviously a horrible communicator, labeled the most progressive or one of the most progressive senators in the U.S. Senate when she was there, by a whole bunch of different ratings groups. I mean, just a true radical. I mean, do you need any more information than that? Kamala Harris is all about equity programs, socialistic programs, big giant government programs, lots of government spending, printing lots of money, no way of balancing the deficit, not interested in helping people unless they fall into the right racial or gender category. I just think that her policies are as radical as they come. I mean, and I think that if most, I think most even moderate Democrats, if they just looked at the policies, would agree with me, at least on a lot of this stuff. Moderate Democrats don't want the end of all fossil fuels and all fossil fuel driven cars within 10 years. Kamala Harris does. They don't want trillions and trillions of dollars of new spending. Kamala Harris does. They don't want every home and business building being upgraded by the federal government. They don't want that. They don't want basic income programs. They don't want government jobs guarantees where everybody is able to work for the federal government whenever they want. They don't want massive wind and solar projects, at least not to the point where it destroys all fracking, destroys all oil and gas industry, destroys all of that stuff, kills farmers, not kills them literally, obviously, but kills their businesses because they produce they depend on fossil fuels in a lot of cases, and they also produce a lot of methane and CO2 emissions. And a lot of these requirements in the Green New Deal would cause that. If you remember right, AOC's original Green New Deal involved basically eliminating cows worldwide, killing livestock or getting rid of them or phasing them out or something. But it very explicitly said that in some of AOC's materials that she posted online, because you can't do the things that she wants to do and Kamala Harris wants to do without getting rid of livestock, or the vast majority of it. We don't have $92 trillion in the Green New Deal. Most moderate Democrats don't want that. Most moderate Democrats don't want the end of private health insurance. Most moderate Democrats don't want all white, all doctors and healthcare professionals being forced to go through radical anti-racism training. They don't want discrimination on the basis of race in government programs like the Save Our Streets Act. Like, they don't want these things. And so, and most moderate Democrats don't want unfettered illegal immigration. They don't want immigrants coming to America illegally and not having any sort of facility for them to go to so they could just go anywhere they want in America. Most moderate Democrats don't want that either. Most moderate Democrats don't want what Kamala Harris is selling. They'll probably vote for her anyway, but they don't want it. This is the most radical presidential candidate we have had in at least modern American history. Certainly, you got to go back to like FDR. Again, Obama is a big asterisk. Obama was really radical, but his policies were nowhere near as radical as I think his own personal ideology was. So you got to go all the way back to like FDR, even earlier than that, probably Woodrow Wilson, to find someone as radical as Kamala Harris. And even they might not be as socialistic and radical as Kamala Harris. I don't think they would have settled for just wide open borders and the end of a provision that would ban the Department of Homeland Security from building or expanding immigrant detention. Like, they wouldn't have supported something crazy like that. So this is one of the most radical presidential candidates, maybe the most radical one that we've had in a long, long time. And we're going to find out within the next few months whether voters want that or not. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be a very important election. Say your prayers, folks. Country needs it. Country needs it. All right. Until next time, my name is Justin Haskins. Thanks for joining me, and please stay free.